Hi, everybody. Welcome to Neighbor Science, the only podcast about political economy and books. Today we have a special guest on, Mel from Coffee with Comrades.
Hi.
Hey, this
Hi.
is Chris and
Ryan.
This is Ryan. Yeah.
Clipping the mic.
So Mel's here because she and I are both writers. We've had to deal with the big world of putting your words out there for people to read, which some call publishing. Mel, thanks for coming on with us.
Yeah, no problem.
So without much more ado, we're just going to dive into these wild notes I threw together at the last minute. Mel, do you want to kind of talk about the early days of printing, since you, I think, have a firmer handle on it than I do?
A firm-ish handle
Firm-ish.
on it. Yeah. I mean, so prior to the creation of the printing press, the Gutenberg printing press, the way that most materials were printed were by hand. Particularly before the 1500s and during the Middle Ages, printing or reproducing any written text was expensive and painstaking and was often reserved for people who could afford it. Church institutions were the main sort of producer of printed material during that time, particularly in the West.
Right.
And yeah, it was expensive. And so you see a lot of like monastic Christian texts are a big one prior to the creation of the printing press. And since, these monasteries were institutions of knowledge and learning, they were usually the ones who were putting out this kind of information. Mostly because that is where the vast majority of individuals got their education during that time. I don't know. You want to add something? You've got some notes in here too.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, it kind of ties in with my understanding of, especially again in the West, quote unquote, how universities were also places of essentially elite learning. So it was typically because of the expense and because of the ties to like the ecclesiastical order, the clergy, etc.
Glad things have changed since then.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. But in the old days, universities and monasteries and all these places were just places where like the rich boys went, and a few nuns maybe. But actually, do you know if did nuns also create their own manuscripts and stuff?
Oh yeah, no. There's a long history of women writers who were abbesses and had their own institutions of learning. And there's quite a few pretty amazing medieval texts written by women. I'd have to pull them up. They're on my shelf somewhere. I did a lot of study of that last year, I think.
Would you mind reading all of them in their entirety for us?
Yeah,
on the show?
absolutely. I mean, they're
Seems like
great.
more than a few of
There's some raunchy love poems, man. Come on.
Oh yeah,
There's-
I have read about those. I was actually more curious about, because I knew that they had all their private letters and things like that. I was curious if they were part of like the formal industry.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they were.
Okay. More, nun drone operators then, I guess. But
Well, I mean, no,
yeah.
they circumvented, conventions of women not necessarily being allowed to publish their own written texts by being anonymous, by using pseudonyms, or in the case of some people like Marie de France, she actually signed all of her work, her written work that she published through these, institutional sort of paradigms.
under her own name, you mean?
Yeah, she wrote, "I name myself so that I may be remembered," and I think that's really cool.
Did anything happen to her because of that?
No.
Nice.
She lived a long, happy life. Published a lot of shit. It helps that she belonged to the higher classes of individuals. She was a cousin to a Plantagenet, I think. I think. So, she's coming from a wealthy background, a landed, almost royal background. So she has the ability to do this. But yeah, so.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, though. I mean, again, yeah, in these extremely hierarchical societies, it helps to be an elite. But if you're from, say, a less powerful class like women in this particular structure, it's still cool that you're able to, get your shit out there and take chances like that. Yeah, so I guess I was also interested in like the industrial aspect of the development of printing presses and stuff ahead of what we now know as kind of modern publishing. So, of course, a lot of people will be familiar with the name Gutenberg. Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century put together what we kind of think of as the printing press, which was based on earlier innovations that were familiar to Europeans, but just hadn't been cobbled together into this particular device yet. I was reading about it, and apparently the screw press, which is like the big screw component that presses these movable type onto the paper or the canvas or whatever you're working with, that was as old as like the Roman Empire. But of course, the Romans, in true Roman fashion, just used it to make wine instead of like industrializing their printing operations.
Nice.
Yeah. So that it's interesting when you think about like the pace of innovations like that could have been really useful for like the populace more broadly, but which probably because of those elite concerns didn't really make it out into this usage, for who knows,
Sort of like how the Chinese had gunpowder for hundreds of years and they didn't even use it to get in boats and massacre a bunch of people.
Right.
What the fuck were they thinking?
How dare they? Yeah, and so Gutenberg, he put together like the screw press, and then this hand mold is I think the term they used, but it was kind of like this matrix on which to place the movable type and set it into place so that you could then essentially like fix it to the screw, I think, or like put it under the screw and then clamp it down and then press the inked type onto paper. And from there, of course, you could basically customize your text using that type and put out just scads of any material you wanted, which was this massive change from the days, as you said, Mel, of like nuns, monks, and the like, doing things by hand and illuminating these scripts and so forth.
Well, I mean, it increased the literacy rate, by what? A large percentage over the first, 5 decades of the printing press, being able to produce, mass produce reading material and change the literary landscape in most of Europe at that time.
Yeah, and wasn't the first, I mean, I'm pretty sure my memory is serving me correctly here, but the first thing that Gutenberg put out was a Bible.
Yep.
And so it was kind of tying itself to the tradition of publication of, spiritual propaganda, if you will, religious propaganda texts, but at the same time using this kind of revolutionary process to do so. And then that was kind of proof of concept that, like people could have access to and use of this now extremely scalable sort of mode of publication.
Right.
And then, of course, inevitably, not only would literacy rise because now there's just more stuff out there and it's just kind of going everywhere, but there's higher volume of texts because there's, again, it's a scalable kind of enterprise or operation, and that leads to a kind of vernacularization. And I was reading that this may or may not have contributed to a lot of the kind of Enlightenment and liberal era and like early modern era developments in like political culture and things like that, because people were suddenly exchanging all these ideas. The ideas were kind of mutating at a higher pace because of their transmission between people. And then people were embracing their vernacular languages more readily than using Latin as the lingua franca, because they were just putting out what was on their own minds.
History tends towards Harry Potter.
Well, I mean, Dante's Inferno is one of the first pieces that was published in the Italian vernacular during the Renaissance. Petrarch is also one of the literary figures of the Italian Renaissance that wrote the majority of his work in the Italian vernacular. Prior to that, again, these religious texts were written in Latin, and the majority of the learned language, right, this language of knowledge of the elites, right, is Latin. If you know Latin, then you are you are able to work within government. You're able to work within spiritual institutions like the Christian Catholic Church. And so the Renaissance is marking a period of really trying to create literature that other people unlearned, if you will, the individuals who spend their entire days speaking in the Italian or whatever vernacular language, accessing that, giving them the ability to access that, which then, 60, 70 years, 80, 100 years later, a couple hundred years later, actually, when the Renaissance reaches England, it's the same thing. You have people like Milton and Spencer writing in English instead of in the Latin language. And as far as like the printing of materials, generally speaking, at least in England and other areas, you had to have permission, a specific sort of like tax stamp that would allow you to print a certain material. So in terms of like censorship, it's still pretty bad. There's he's a contemporary of Spencer, Edmund Spencer. I can't remember his name, but he printed some satire. It was part of a group of satirists in England who published some shit that pissed off the wrong people, and they rounded up all of his published work and burned it. And there's like this, we only know about this author by name now because all of his material was burnt and banned from, the ability to like publish. Like his career is torpedoed. So, as far as like, in the early modern era with printing presses, these the ability to sort of circulate this written material still had checks by state institutions that made, the printing of any seditious material, like some of the stuff that you and I would, cut our teeth on at that time, it would be a, jailable or even capital offense, just to print this, right? And to disseminate that information.
Yeah, and that actually really contextualizes, I think, what many people in the States take for granted almost as like a figure of speech in the phrase, the freedom of the press, right? Which, at the time of the American Revolution and the French Revolution and all this, that was still a major concern in a very immediate and kind of physical way, because like there was a press probably in your town or a few of presses in your city that could just be wrecked or, stopped somehow by the authorities. And they did so quite frequently, throughout that era. So, I mean, yeah. Again,
Christian Europe also has a really long history of book burnings.
Yeah, exactly. Book burnings.
That's basically how they came to power, I think.
Yeah.
By burning libraries.
Yeah,
and
it's
a lot of texts. I was going to say this earlier, but I just missed my chance. A lot of texts from the European ancient world were preserved by Arab scholars who kind of, went through the effort of copying them and keeping them in their libraries, and then they made their way back over here. Yeah,
Yeah, and that was a whole other process. That, I mean, if we're talking about the preservation of like Greek texts and stuff in particular, and then the sort of rediscovery of European, older Greek texts and stuff via interaction with the Middle East, particularly through things like the Crusades, then that in large part led to the quote unquote Renaissance, and the flourishing of the Western world in many ways.
Yeah, supposedly part of the reason the Renaissance happened is because there was for a long time a church policy of not like you couldn't like cite anything by a Muslim scholar, and they stopped doing that, and then magically science and math exploded. But a lot of the time, like European scholars would just claim that either an ancient Greek or just themselves like wrote something that they got from
Right.
Asia.
Yeah.
And,
interesting.
Yeah. So a lot of what we consider to be like European scholarship was actually, from Asia.
That makes sense too.
Yeah. Sorry, that was a tangent.
No, that's a good tangent.
Yeah.
I mean, I choose to, whenever I'm, spending some time in Renaissance scholarship, I find it interesting that, most people think it was wasn't just like a rediscovery of these texts, right? It was, or the rebirth of culture, right? Because there's no such thing as dark ages,
Right.
Yeah.
Like the medieval world had its own culture, but it's interesting to see how that contributed to innovation, like the printing press and other cultural innovation that is sort of it's on its own thing. I think a lot about like Spencer, like English epic poets, like Shakespeare, those types of things that are pretty interesting given the time period and what was going on there.
Mm-hmm. So let's move on to kind of that early modern era where the printing press had now proliferated. It was kind of all over Europe. Obviously, the powers that be began their several 100-year tantrum over the freedom of information, essentially, which hasn't really stopped, only become more sophisticated. I remember from my undergrad in English that a couple of my profs who specialized in the kind of 15 to 1700s, they talked a lot about like the era of ephemera, just basically like very tiny publications that you could just get off the street. They were being kind of hawked on the street. Maybe it would be like a page or a half page. Yeah, they were like zines. They were like blog posts of the time.
It's pamphleting.
Exactly, pamphleting. And it would be any number of genres, obviously, because people were just putting out whatever was on their mind. And like a lot of these things, as I understand it, and Mel, you can correct me, would be things like the quartos and folios that people like Shakespeare and other playwrights and writers and poets would put out. Am I correct in that?
Yeah.
Okay. And these would be available for sale, or they would just be made available kind of like the program at a play, or...
As far as... Okay. Oh, yeah. So generally speaking, you could order them. If I'm remembering this correctly, a lot of times you would order the loose pages and then get them bound. So if you notice in a lot of like older, early modern libraries, all of the books have the same covers. It's because you ordered the loose pages from printers, and then bound them yourself or had a bookbinder bind them. So the quartos are named for their size, like a quarter page kind of thing. And generally speaking, you would walk into a printer and you would say, do you have, printers would have like if I'm remembering this correctly, would have an author's work in loose pages, and you could say, I would like a copy of that. Can you make a copy of that? And you could buy it that way. But generally speaking, like, there weren't really like bookstores really until the mid 1800s rather. So and that had there's a whole like cultural significance to that, and the availability of various works. But generally speaking, that's kind of the shorthand history of that.
Okay, cool. Now that's actually really illuminating and ties, I think, really well in with like what we're going to be discussing with the sort of the book industry, the publishing industry. So I have some notes here about this early modern era where small presses were everywhere. There was a development of, just like we said, newspapers, magazines, gazettes, pamphlets, etc., all these small pubs. And this kind of set up a foundation for this culture that we have now.
Fascist mass cult.
Yes.
Sure, yeah.
According to
Exactly.
the great scholar Phil Greaves.
But like this was kind of like a precursor for what we might even think of as like pop culture or mass cult. There was just prepared narratives, as I'm putting it here, floating around everywhere, and these small publications that, like you said, Mel, you could walk into a place and order a copy of something, click share, click like. And I think that this is one of the reasons that when we look at early modern Europe and early modern, like the colonial states and territories, because of their attachment to the European imperial projects and industries, why these times in these places are kind of more legible to us as early modern, because things like this were developing that are now kind of the norm to us now. And capitalism as a mode, as a system, was also kind of firing up at the time. And there were, as we will see, many different kind of elements of each interacting and meshing together as capitalism kind of co-opted this kind of innovation. So I found it interesting how the printing press and the sort of developments in publication modes greatly increased the potential for mass production and distribution of these prepared narratives, of these kind of vernacular ideas, really, and people's thoughts about their world and all the sort of philosophy that started swimming around. But meanwhile, the sort of the bourgeoisie and the capitalists were beginning to increasingly dominate economic activity, and liberalism was becoming more popular, and the press enabled sort of all of these things, or was co-opted by people with power. But it could also
leverage. Capitalists even leveraged the press in order to sort of continue to switch and propagandize their narrative against the aristocracy that was losing its economic sort of prowess in the wake of this, growing merchant class. And I think of like Matthew Arnold's terrible book. Now I'm going to forget the name of it, but essentially it talks about the weak aristocracy and the need to make sure that the working class has the right idea about the place in which they are supposed to be. And it's a great book. You should read it. fume with me. But yeah, no, just co-opting these narratives and using something like the printing press and the ability to make these sort of materials widely available is like a way to control that narrative. You know,
wasn't there some
today
robber baron from the 19th century that was like the newspaper was the best investment I ever made or something like that?
Maybe.
I vaguely remember something like that. Probably Rockefeller.
Probably.
I wouldn't know off the top of my head, but it sounds right because, again, the press or the kind of information industry is extremely scalable. Right. So it makes sense if you're going to invest in something, you're going to invest in something like that can just kind of go everywhere and always be making money. If you're doing like the Fox News model and investing in people's like fear,
I think they also had they basically had the newspapers propagandize for their companies when labor agitated against them.
Yeah, you see a lot of that. I think what's also interesting is that the printing press and that the further development of that technology also enabled the printing of paper money, right? So suddenly you go from the kind of coins and stuff with seigniorage and all this other stuff we've talked about in previous episodes, to like rather finely detailed and watermarked paper money that you can create at very low cost, ostensibly, and essentially do what the state wishes to do with money, which is to kind of penetrate every decision of your life, right? But one of the cool things about printing presses, on the other sort of hand, is that they meant that you could now create things like public libraries and blocks. Yeah. And I think this kind of touches on, Mel, what you were saying about like the eventual rise of bookstores as kind of a model. But of course, libraries versus bookstores is kind of this interesting. There's a tension there because bookstores are for profit and libraries are just for common use. Another thing that happened, which I'm sure I've talked about before, is that coffee and chocolate houses at the time, which came from European colonialism and trade, and their exposure to other cultures and other commodities. So they adopted the coffee house and the chocolate house as kind of like...
How did chocolate houses disappear?
I don't know. It sounds dope. We need more of those. Yeah.
Honestly.
I think they fused them into coffee houses. A chocolate's a snack now as opposed to like a
Did you have those delicious chocolate-covered coffee beans?
Oh, yeah. Those are good.
That's pretty much the apex of civilization, I think.
Yeah, they declined with the rise of the diner. That's what it is.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So
I have no idea if that's actually legit. I'm just saying that's probably what happened.
I mean, I guess if it's between a chocolate house and a Waffle House, I guess I'd probably pick Waffle House.
Same. Mm-hmm. Same.
So there's an interesting theory of the coffee house, the chocolate house, and I think the diner as well counts for this anyway, which is that they are a third place which replaced the disappearing commons. So people were like, well, I don't want to be at home, and obviously I don't want to be at work. I want to be where people are so I can talk to them or selectively ignore them or whatever. Enjoy myself, though. So coffee, chocolate, diners, etc., that's kind of where you ended up going. And this touches on, like the rise of everything's consumerism, everything's a transactional activity. But in these places, you're at least allowed typically to kind of hang out. And because of that, and because of the burgeoning of the printing industry, publishing industry, people would show up to these places. They'd be from all sorts of walks of life, and they'd end up chatting. They would interact with the ephemera, these various publications that were laid out in these places to enjoy, whether it was newspapers or magazines or pamphlets or what have you. And then
they would underwrite ship voyages.
Yes, exactly. That was one of the things that they would do, is they would have like a chalkboard or something, and they'd write up like, okay, who wants to essentially bet on this venture, invest in this venture, and it would be a ship or something, usually a ship.
I got to get this one out now too. What if it's a coffee house, but it's a house made of coffee?
Happily.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the interesting sort of aspects of this is that the sort of third place full of small publications where people were imbibing in stimulants and snacks and stuff, so they could stay there like all day if they felt like it, and just, you know, receive and discuss information with whoever was around, and the acceleration of the availability of information and sort of the motivation for people to be interacting with each other over like all sorts of ideas and, you know, news about politics, war, scandals, gossip, whatever, essentially formed in combination an accelerator for capitalism as well as like radical politics, and also many, as I recall, reactionary politics, like a bunch of like essentially like tradcaths, you know, running around like trying to reassert Catholicism on, you know, things like that. And then people would have these arguments and all this shit, and then of course that would lead to more conflict, and that would lead to often more repression, like, oh, these people are causing a stir and we have to stop these commoners from talking and causing mobs, and, you know.
The Dark Renaissance by Nico Plaza.
Yeah, right. And so basically they were the first shit posters in a sense. It was like that era's equivalent of getting high and sitting online for hours. Yeah. So let's see. Where was I? Oh yeah, and then as we discussed in an episode or two ago, the UK in particular was also working on increasing the quality of their roads and their road system throughout this era, which meant that not only were they getting more information, you know, and broader information from many, many sources through the press, but they were getting it faster, and probably more completely, because there's just more and more and more coming in all the time. Right. Than people were elsewhere in the world. So this is kind of just saying, again, this was an acceleration kind of dynamic.
Yeah.
And it probably felt to them a lot like the kind of Web 2.0 has felt to us, where you're just like, whoa, holy shit, there's just like information and disinformation.
You can get a letter from someone in like a day or two.
Yeah, exactly. Which is just madness. Yeah. How am I supposed to keep up with this? You know? Any thoughts on that, Mel?
No, I have more thoughts later on industrial processes than I do on this. So.
Cool. So yeah, so that kind of just sets the stage. I didn't really put much in for the next stage, which is essentially that like early industrial kind of 19th century publishing. But you did allude to that.
You just mean about the history of industrial publishing? I mean,
yeah,
a lot of stuff comes out of being able to mass produce material, and particularly with publishing in the Victorian era, you have the rise of yellow journalism.
Oh yeah,
during that time, and the sort of sensationalism that comes from the sort of odd journalistic practices of the time, particularly the sort of accounts that come out of journalists and upper class individuals who continued the practice of slumming it in like London's to East End and stuff, and going undercover into workhouses and coming out with very homoerotic sort of accounts of what goes on in the workhouses and stuff. Just weird stuff coming out of that, right? And then being mass produced and sort of published in these various magazines and periodicals and newspapers at the time. You know, we're talking about Victorians who would get into like long drawn out like shit post fights, right? Where they're publishing letters in these periodicals and starting fights with other prominent other Victorians. There's a lot of really hilarious stuff that happens.
And you're talking about like the essentially elites in this case, right?
Well,
Yes.
they're all considered, you know, the literary elites, right? You know,
Right.
you're thinking of like Edinburgh's Blackwood's magazine, which is,
Right.
you know, the literati of Scotland, and you know all these various groups that are upper middle class, merchant class, or aristocracy, yelling at each other in these periodicals, essentially, right?
So basically, Real Housewives.
Essentially, yeah. Or, you know, the same sort of like the Twitter drama that we see today is just
Right.
one permutation of the same bullshit, right? The quote tweeting and calling out
Yeah.
and all that fun stuff. It's been going on for forever. But,
Yeah.
you know, the industrial processes created a rise in the sort of like dime novels of various genres, like the Penny Dreadfuls and the other things, right? These pieces of pop culture that previously were it was impossible to create that sort of like consumable prior to more industrialized printing practices. And it, you know, here's a little fun tidbit. Sort of tangentially related. Willis Carrier, the guy who invented electric air conditioning,
It's weird
Worked-
you're talking about that, and the air conditioning just kicked on.
yeah, I can
Summoned
hear
Willis.
that. Well, he worked for the Sackett Willems Lithographing and Publishing Company in Brooklyn, New York, and they were having trouble lining up print pages in this massive print warehouse, right? Because it was too hot. It was this really hot summer. And, you know, God forbid the people working in that warehouse are dying of heat stroke. It's fine. But, you know, the ink didn't dry properly. So so Willis Carrier created electric air conditioning in order to make the process more streamlined so that they didn't have to continue throwing out fucked up pages that didn't have the right kind of temperature for ink to dry properly. I just think that's an interesting story. You know, we have this, it creates this rise of this particular industrial process that made up a vast majority of factory jobs or contributed to a very large portion of the industrial economy in various Western countries. So, you know, and publishing was, I don't know, just it's just an interesting sort of place to be as a artist, I guess. And, you know, like people you have in your notes that it was derided as a purely commercial affair that cared more about profits than literary quality. I mean, honestly, it's kind of true.
Oh, yeah, and that's most of what we're about to talk about.
Again, I'm glad that these things have changed since then.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
So basically, like...
It's my favorite part about reading history in journals, just seeing how different everything is than the past.
yeah. Things are totally different. It's just kind of funny thinking about how, like, it's extremely commercial and it's just a bunch of rich kids just, like, shitting on each other, you know, in public. And then, like, half the promising artists out there just, like, can't get published to save their lives, almost literally to save their lives, you know.
Right.
Just
Definitely
because
different.
we
have moved so far past that to this in this new promising millennium.
Yes, bright
Absolutely.
futures. And yeah, thank you, Jeff Bezos. I light a candle for you every night. Nah, fuck that guy. So and this is kind of how, you know, the tentacles of capitalism have wrapped themselves around the world of art in this particular form to kind of choke off the supply of actual worthwhile literature.
I don't like the implication that capitalism is an octopus, because octopuses are cool.
That's true. I apologize. Let's just pretend it's like a robot octopus that's trying to kill the real
The robo-tentacles of capitalism.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it extends beyond just straight literature too, right? For-profit publishing companies that create the textbooks that are sold to the high schools and the elementary schools where our children are educated, and you know, those for-profit companies essentially have 100% control over what type of information they put into a textbook. So you can whitewash your history to the nth degree, and no one's going to stop you.
Exactly.
Right?
And you're incentivized to do so because, you know, big business loves big business. You know, it's just one billionaire to another.
Right.
Yeah,
well, and it's like, you know, and, you know, like I think of, you know, you have Pearson PLC is one of the global publishing operations in these notes, and their text, their history and literature textbook offshoot, I forget whatever it's called, has essentially contracted with every single high school in like, say for example, the state of Texas, right? And are like is the only corporation that you can buy textbooks from in order to furnish textbooks to your school district. So there's like there's insidious ways that these types of this misinformation, essentially, this that's been turned into like official propaganda, is disseminated to education centers and learning centers, and you know, so the problem with printing and publishing extends far beyond you and I's issues with the fiction publishing industry.
True.
You know.
True, and I want to say, of course, that the educational side of it is one of the more deeply insidious aspects of the industry because of that. The control over people's awareness of their own past.
Yes.
So
and then university publishing is crazy too, with how you have to pay like $40 to read a journal article.
It's ridiculous.
Or I think one of the things they do for science journals is they take all the really important ones and they bundle them with a ton of other like crap ones that no one wants. So if you want Nature, which is like the main science journal, you have to pay like $1 million a year for this big package of other journals in order to get it. And so they just squeeze tons of money out of universities that way.
Yeah.
They
In addition
also,
to like having you have to pay to publish science articles and shit like that.
Yeah. They also institute 2, 3, 4 year long embargoes on recently published work so that you're required to buy the journal in order to read it.
Right.
So a lot of times, especially with literature analysis and scholarship, you won't be able to find the most recent articles simply because they want you to, you know, write a subscription or to pay for one. Which would make sense if they were paying the scholars that they solicit articles from, but
Exactly.
they don't.
They do the opposite, actually.
You gotta go through fucking hell in order to even get published in a journal, and you don't get paid for it.
Yeah.
Fancy that. Anyway.
We have to have Patreons for scientists.
Yeah, seriously.
They already exist. But yeah, Chris, you seem to have a better conception of like actual traditional publishing than I do.
Okay.
I don't know.
I'll take your word for it.
I haven't necessarily had like a whole lot of personal experience with traditional publishing. Besides, you know, sort of academic interest in how it works. So.
Yeah, so I was very fortunate in undergrad to have a couple of different mentors who were successful in the traditional publishing realm. One who wrote children's fiction and has been putting out like a book a year for like the past 40 years. And then the other was a more recent kind of, creative but still unexpectedly successful poet from the Midwest scene. And then, as with, I think, many, worthwhile English or literature programs, there was like a yearly writing festival kind of thing where they would invite various authors and industry professionals to come and talk about the world of books and writing and publishing and editing and all this stuff. So I got quite a lot of information about especially traditional publishing because I went to undergrad in the twilight years before the rise of the current forms of self-publishing that are much more kind of accessible and can be much more profitable than the kind of 19th, 20th century sort of self-publishing models. So I was going to just give some of my insights and a little bit of the additional research that I put into traditional publishing and then the current forms. Well, the 19th to 20th century self-publishing and then the current forms of self-publishing that are being popularized. So in traditional publishing, as in industrial publishing, the publishing houses like Penguin, Random House, they kind of act as venture capitalists on one side, as well as being producers. So they place bets on books in much the same way as venture capitalists place bets on startups or other initiatives, where they say, do we think that this is going to do well on the market? Mm-hmm. Do we think that this book by this writer is going to sell X amount of copies or more? And they do what capitalists do. They perform some kind of fancy risk analysis. They perform, some kind of sales analysis based on what's on the market at the time. And as with venture capitalists, they anticipate that a lot of their investments, they won't do that well, and some will fail, but that some of their investments will do spectacularly well. So they kind of design their bets that way. They want to put out a high volume of books. These big houses do. They want to put out a high volume of books so that they kind of maintain a grip on the market. Mm-hmm. They want to take risks, just enough risks, so that like some might fail, quote unquote, not get as many sales as they want, but that again, a few will do spectacularly well. The J.K. Rowlings, the Stephen Kings, etc. So they are generally effective in insuring themselves against risk in this way, because again, they're using the logic of the venture capitalist, right? They put enough money in to put, say the initial run of books out per, physical copies of a book per book, and hopefully pull in a profit. And there's a whole other rabbit hole with distribution and wholesale and all these bookstores out there. Big bookstores like Barnes and Noble, small bookstores like the mom and pops and stuff. And we don't even have to get into used bookstores and stuff because that's not really part of the publishing industry per se. So, but yeah, while this kind of betting approach that is extremely kind of capitalist minded is generally effective in keeping them from risking too much, and in terms of finance, in terms of profits, it has really detrimental effects for creators and for the quality of the writing that is often put out, because they're looking for a sure thing. They want something that they can quantify and predict, which means that this is fine if you're a farmer, right?
Yeah.
this is great if you're an architect. You're like, well, I want this many beams and this many tiles, and I want it to last 100 years or whatever. That's great. But in terms of these scalable enterprises where you're just disseminating information or art or some combination thereof, as with literature, it can be really problematic because this risk aversion turns into a kind of conservative cultural skew, right? And that includes often being averse to the kinds of artistic innovations that are possible, and that many authors and, say, illustrators who are part of the publishing industry as well are putting out there or hoping to put out there. So the creativity of the industry is limited by the financial sort of paranoia of capitalism, you know? And so it's not even just that, like, oh, editors are fuddy-duddies or anything like that. A lot of editors are actually writers themselves, and that's how they got into this stuff. And a lot of them they would love to see more books out there, more creative books out there. But then the internal operations of these houses are also very, corporate style. They have these editors processing these slush piles, as they call them, and like, Mel, you know what that is. Ryan, do you know what a slush pile is?
No idea.
Okay, so a slush pile is basically it's all of the fucking manuscripts that get submitted to the house just piled up. And there are so many, because there's so many creative people out there, and people who aspire to at least put out one book, you know, that these poor editors and the interns, of course, are inundated with like tens of thousands of copies per year, and they basically review each manuscript the way that, like, your average hiring manager now reviews a resume. They give it like 10 seconds.
Wow.
Yeah. So it is brutal. And the reason, part of the reason that this occurs is because the big houses have an oligopoly, right? They are the only ones with enough capital to make bets, but their bets are risk averse for, profiteering purposes. And so they're not just going to go, okay, you gave me a manuscript, I'll just put it in my digital library or whatever, and we'll be able to print it at any time. And this is a foreshadowing of the other stuff, by the way. They'll just take the first page of, like, a submission, like a proposal letter, essentially, and they'll look at it and be like, not really what we're looking for, and pretty much you'll never hear from them again, right? So people like, actually, J.K. Rowling, she's kind of one of these paragons of both the negative and the positive side for an author in this process, where she submitted for a long, long time. She just got rejected. Then when she finally made it, she made it big.
Yeah.
So, of course, as is typical of the capitalist ideology, everyone says, well, maybe I could be J.K. Rowling, so I'm going to, like, accept this horrible process because there's, like, a lottery chance that I'll get billions of dollars. In the meantime, no, that won't happen for you. I'm sorry.
I mean, and it's incredibly coercive for the people who do get accepted. Say, for example, you get accepted by a traditional publishing house. They will advance you a certain amount of money that you are required to pay back. Usually with sales, you try to pay it back with book sales, which is why you want your book to get big, because you are ultimately paying for the process. So if you don't sell a whole lot of copies, you are still on the hook for whatever that advance is, which can be up to, $200,000-$300,000 or more,
lucky.
$1 million book deal or whatever, right?
Yeah.
That's like Milo Yiannopoulos lost his book deal and was required to pay that money back to the publishing house, which is one of the main reasons why he went bankrupt.
Yeah.
Well, in most
know?
cases that sucks, but in this case, I'm going to say, ha,
Oh,
ha,
it's
ha,
beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. It's just, that's the one example that I'm thinking of. But, it's like, so even if you're accepted by a traditional publishing house and you go through the whole process and you don't make it J.K. Rowling big, like you could potentially bankrupt yourself and damage any chances at creatively, reaching that far ever again, essentially.
Exactly. And I've heard that if I've heard that if you get an advance and your your sales don't break even on the advance, if it was a smallish advance, they may just kind of write it off and be like, well, we're not really that interested in you after all, but you don't have to pay it back. It's fine. But they can choose to make you pay it back. And I think that depends largely on your relationship with them, which is a bit like sucking up to the boss so you don't get fired, So basically, yeah.
Or if you have a smart agent, if you go the route of submitting to an agent first, hopefully they would put some sort of negotiate some sort of clause in your contract with this publishing house that if you don't make a certain percentage of sales by a certain period of time, then the publishing company won't require you to pay back the advance.
Yeah.
But if you're a big enough fish or they give you big enough money, they're going to ask for it back.
Exactly.
Again, it's a cost-benefit analysis, and they
Yep.
want to make sure that they're not losing too much on a roll of the dice.
Exactly. And what's also interesting is when you look at the breakdown of like the proceeds of a book, the return on the sale. This example that I pulled from, I think, I forget if it was Wikipedia or Quora. I think it was Wikipedia. Yeah. I'll just read it right off. It is a common practice that the author signs the contract awarding him or her only around 10% of the proceeds of the book. Such a contract leaves 90% of the book proceeds to the publishing houses, distribution companies, marketers, and retailers. One example of the distribution of proceeds from the sale of a book was given as follows. 45% to the retailer, 10% to the wholesaler, 10 and a few decimals percent to the publisher for printing, 7.15% to the publisher for marketing, 12.7% to the publisher for pre-production, and then 15% to the author in royalties, which is, of course, after the advance breaks even. Then
45% to the retailer is crazy.
Yeah. And this is just another example of, like, the expectations of capitalist business when it comes to the kind of money that they're trying to make, Now,
retailers don't even do anything. They just own shelves.
right.
They get almost half of the money.
Right. Like, there's something to be said for, like, the staff working the space and keeping things in. Really? No?
Really? I worked at Barnes & Noble for a while. Yeah.
So you just open the doors?
Pretty much. And, stock the shelves. And
what do they pay there? Like $9 an hour?
Pretty much, yeah. And the
45%.
the retailer marks up the price a lot of the time.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
They'll fuck with the printing so that it only costs like $2 to print the book, but they'll set the price that's on the back of it. And Barnes and Noble does a lot of that. But the fun fact is that after a certain printing, you go through all the shelves with a scanner. And if it beeps at you, you take the book. This usually happens like twice a year. You'll take the book to the back. You'll put it on a shelf that'll go back to the publishing house, but you'll rip the front cover off.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about this.
Yes,
my mom had a job doing that when I was a kid.
You rip the front cover off and you send the covers back, and then you chuck the rest of the book. So it's just a waste of paper. It's the worst job ever. I hate it.
Christ.
I hated it. But yeah, so as far as like the retailer making all the money, yeah, that's That's a big thing. And most employees don't really see it, especially at Barnes & Noble. They fired all their full-time employees, so, it's fine. Capitalism. It's good for you.
Yeah.
Makes you thinner. It's fine.
Right. Then there's this line about there's a common misconception that publishing houses make large profits and that authors are the lowest paid in the publishing chain. And the funny thing is that, like, there are people who make a shit ton of money being in charge of publishing houses and the, like, conglomerates that control, printing and distribution, all this bullshit. Because they don't just sell one book. Like, so this is kind of muddying the waters here. Anyway, so we've now kind of covered a lot of the traditional publishing. I didn't really want to get into, like, distribution too much. There are, of course, small presses that are out there, whether they are just, printers or they're publishers or there's some combination thereof. But as with a lot of small businesses, I think your mileage may vary with kind of how well they do. Hard to really say. But they definitely don't have the kind of capital the big ones do to take risks on a lot of different publications. And so they tend to be like boutique, or they just put out like
AK Press and stuff like that.
Yeah. Or they like, people like us who just put things out on Patreon or like have zines or something. Any more insights, Mel, before we move on to self-publishing?
Well, I mean, like, small presses that are... Isn't AK Press like a co-op model, though?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that distribution is, AK is sort of the co-op collective model of worker-owned independent presses, which is an interesting thing to examine. I didn't do enough research for this episode, but
okay. We do that every episode.
Yeah, just like the idea that in a worker-owned sort of like co-op model, generally you would think that those who are publishing with that small press are going to be seeing a much larger portion of the profit or the royalties or own all of the profit beyond the cost of, making and selling. I don't know. I'm curious to see how that looks in, an independent press. Is it sort of just a vehicle for printing on demand? Is it, does the press own the rights to the book? Is the author, leasing the sort of, licensing this work to this press in order to print it, in order to sell it? Like, I'm interested in seeing how that.
Yeah, I don't think it's print on demand
out.
because you can go to an online bookstore and find books by AK Press and just buy them.
True. Yeah. But I just mean like in various other paradigms. Like,
yeah.
How does that
I'm
look?
interested how they got the capital to start printing in the first place.
They've been going since 1999.
And that's it.
They've been sinking the majority of their money directly back into the distribution and press itself because it's worker owned by 7 people.
Oh wow.
Yeah, okay.
And the vast majority of the money that they make goes directly back into the business. They don't really, I think for the first 5 or 10 years, it was literally just sinking money into it and being a distribution center for radical publications until they, got up enough cash just by constantly trying to scale the business without padding their own pockets so that they could start printing their own work and having authors submit to them and sort of go that route. But it's interesting to see how that plays out. I'm not sure. I haven't done enough research. I mostly know most of this because I've been attempting to try and figure out exactly how I could replicate that model in my own little plan
cool.
B after leaving academia. It's an independent, radical bookstore and learning center and publishing arm. So we'll see how that goes.
I mean, it seems like there's a lot of potential out there, especially these days. And there have been some innovations in like print on demand and stuff, which segues us somewhat smoothly to
POD,
print on demand, and the
Payable
rise
on Death.
Payable on Death, Payable on Death books, and the rise of self-publishing in the current era. But first, I'm going to just kind of mention self-publishing in the, let's say, early industrial publishing era. It seems to have gone from the kind of, the pre-steam engine era where it was like you could kind of self-publish through a small press in your town, and it was perfectly reasonable to do so, and a lot of people did so. And it was just kind of up to you to figure out whether you were going to make money on that or not. But then as sort of industrial publishing rose and these big houses took over, then self-publishing turned into a less viable approach because of the amount of capital that it took to put out a book that you might expect to sell at some large scale. So there were these things that people called vanity presses, and I'm sure they still exist in some form or other. This is one thing that my one prof in particular warned everybody about. He's like, don't ever self-publish. That's just, it's bullshit. Like, you'll just sink your money into something that won't sell because blah, 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 blah. Vanity presses were just set up to essentially take your money, print out a bunch of books that you then have to sell yourself, like physical books, This is prior to, the rise of ebooks and the rise of like today's print-on-demand services. But another interesting thing about this prof, my mentor, was that he kind of had this notion, this kind of, I hate to say it, a slightly bootlicker notion that like if you can't get approved by a publishing house, then your story either isn't worth publishing or just like isn't ready yet, and you need to keep working on it and all this kind of stuff. And like, that might be
mindset.
Yeah, you have to pass through the ultimate gate in order to be a legitimate published author or whatever. Which is still the prevailing notion in many literary circles.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
I was kind of thinking it might actually be the rise of bookstores that are responsible for the existence of large industrial publishers, because that's like where the model makes the most sense is, the books that people are able to read or that people, can read are basically controlled by a small handful of people. So if you're someone who has all of the printing capacity, then you can basically like negotiate directly with them.
Yeah.
I mean, it used to be like way back in the day, it used to be like a Sears catalog of literature, right? Like if it wasn't serialized in a periodical or anything like that, then like actual novels and books like that, you could pick out of a Sears catalog, and
I
they
think
would
I remember
print.
getting some book catalog when I was a kid.
Yeah,
What it was,
it's the sort of scholastic shit, but like,
oh yeah,
Yeah.
but like generally speaking, that's how those books were sold way back in the day, if I remember correctly. So you could order it through the catalog; it would be printed on demand and then sent to your house. Or bookstores, the rise of bookstores was essentially ordering 2 of every one in the catalog and putting it on a shelf.
Right. So basically, since I want to say, like just early 2000s or so, through Amazon and maybe like one or two other, Barnes and Noble had this thing too. I think they still do this. They developed these self-publishing services that initially were treated with sort of suspicion and contempt by the literary establishment and by authors who were already established. so forth and so on, because of this gatekeeping culture and all this bullshit. Also because at the time these services were not really refined. These businesses were still figuring out kind of how to really do this well, and kind of artfully, and in a way that was also, profitable for them. But in the past, 10, 15 years, the process has gotten smoother. The services have gotten better. The sort of devil's bargain that you have to strike with them to get your work out there is just a little bit less painful. And in my case, I put out some ebooks for virtually free, and then it was up to me to, make sales, So in this case, it's like you are still fronting your own capital, not by trying to pay off in advance, as with the traditional model, but simply by paying out your own cash for things like marketing, or like book covers. And it's at least technically possible to, design and print your own book without the help of, say, Amazon or Barnes and Noble. But it is much more difficult, which is why I ended up just going through Amazon, even though I fucking hate Jeff Bezos. So this kind of opens up, I think, a lot of possibility, and kind of it loosens up, I think, people's notions of like not eligibility, legitimacy when it comes to publications and the kinds of work that you're putting out there. And Mel, you put some notes in here about the potential for self-publishing and small presses. And I kind of want to hear your thoughts, kind of elaborating on that.
Well, I mean, like, as we've sort of talked about, traditional publishing ventures are looking for the easiest sell, which means, the narrative is going to be, it's going to have its wings clipped a little bit, You're trying to appeal to the largest possible consumer base, so you're not necessarily interested in publishing radical literature or what, quote, controversial opinions or ideas or things that could potentially, challenge the cultural hegemonic structure, right? Like these types of things that are going to like make people think and potentially want to consider more radical forms of restructuring both cultural spaces as well as, political spaces. And so self-publishing your work is one of those ways to sort of get around that, for various reasons. If you are willing to self-publish your own work, a lot of times, especially if it's digital, you're not sinking a whole lot of money into the process, right? Like, so you're not necessarily going to lose a whole lot of money if the book itself is not particularly successful in the conventional sense. And if you're looking to do sort of print ideas, the Amazon print on demand is something that's also going to potentially not give you too much of a hole to climb out of when you're using that type of stuff. But I just mean like in terms of like the controlling of content and the ability to sort of the ability to just publish your opinions, dissenting or otherwise, right? You have much more leeway in how you structure that and what you can say than you would with more traditional avenues of publishing. And same thing with radical newspapers and zines and self-published work. Like there's a long legacy of disseminating seditious material, essentially, within the realm of these areas, right? If you don't like what the New York Times is saying, then you publish in Protean magazine. Hey, what's up? Like that kind of shit, right? If we feel that we are being underrepresented in media spaces, then we can create our own media space, and that's one of the cool things about self-publishing and about these projects that are more DIY or counterculture, is that we have the ability to do that, and the internet makes it 10 times easier. I just think of digital libraries like the Anarchist Library and things like that are sort of aggregating these fucking centuries of good leftist political writing in one space, and being able to give you high quality PDFs so you can print any of that shit on your own without the need of, having to go through the shitty centrist gatekeepers that are traditional publishing houses.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Well, and you can, again, it's the idea of radical. These are all the comments that I've been making in various conversations over the last couple of years. But if we're looking to sort of restructure economically, any sort of section of our own economy into worker-owned spaces, then this is one of those arms of that, right? Like Radical Presses is co-ops or worker-owned collectives, much like Protean Magazine is. It's worker owned, and we have chosen not to pay ourselves, but to make sure that writers are paid a living wage when they choose to publish with us, right? And it's like our budget is tiny and a little shoestring, but we get it done. And so these ventures are there's no, I don't know. There's a lot there. There's a lot of potential there for disseminating good information and creating a much more robust literary quote canon than what is currently allowed by various well-established publishing and scholastic structures, I suppose.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I think that's actually a pretty solid spot to wrap up, unless you guys had any final comments or plugs you wanted to throw in there.
I was thinking about how this is going to kind of date the show, but there's this whole debate now about whether Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post to use it as a vehicle for propagandizing in favor of Amazon or whatever.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Which,
yes.
I mean, he more or less said it explicitly because he was like,
he is Jeff Bezos.
He made some comment about how this isn't a profitable investment. I'm doing it for reasons other than to make money. It's what other reasons could there be?
The capitalist propaganda arm of Amazon.
Are we supposed to believe that he wants to do the right thing and
and I mean
uphold journalism as a principle?
Yeah. And the new Amazon site will be in Crystal City, which is the DC area. So if they have that fucking evil pyramid of death there, and they own the WAPO, which is already bad enough, generally speaking, but if they're kind of in charge of that publication, then game over for DMV.
Yeah.
Mel, anything else you wanted to close with?
Support Protean Magazine on Patreon and Kickstarter. Also, you can also support Coffee with Comrades on Patreon. We have a lot of really cool stuff coming out for Coffee with Comrades coming up. So a lot of good conversations, really interesting interviews, and thanks for having me on, guys. You guys are cool. Thanks for talking about some nerdy shit close to my heart. So
yeah, we're happy to have you. It was a really great topic to dive into with you, and I know all three of us have been looking forward to doing this episode for a little while now.
Yeah.
So
we should do this again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Just DM us.
Will do.
Yeah. So I guess if you all liked that episode, feel free to stop by neighborsciencepodcast.com. On Twitter, we're at neighborscipod. I'm at solidarity_goth. Ryan's at handle of rye. Mel is at cold brewed tool. And what's the at for Coffee with Comrades?
It's just coffeewithcomrades.com. Mm-hmm. It'll take you right to our Libsyn page. You can listen to any of our episodes. We just came out with an episode with the Wrong Boys, with Seriously Wrong podcast.
Nice. It was so good.
about super online leftism and how toxic that is. So, yeah, it's a good time.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. Bye.